Right on, Jeff. That was a great talk. I love how we talked through the SLOs and the tracing as a way to educate other people. We did have a couple of questions come through that I thought maybe I could send your way and see if you could help us out, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to answer anything related to that.
Awesome. So the first one is any advice for instrumenting code to be used in distributed tracing, self-instrumenting versus auto-instrumentation, and particularly with existing code bases that have no instrumentation currently.
Yeah, I think that there's obviously a lot more nuance, I think, to that question than what I can provide. But I think from a high level, the most important piece is standardization. And so whatever the right path is, so that places, across of this the system that you're instrumenting traces or metrics or really any observability, that there's a consistency there. And so whatever the path is to get there, I think auto instrumentation as a concept is obviously very powerful. Like the batteries included approach is really, really great. I think one thing that some of the like automatic systems miss is the thoughtfulness that is
Mhm.
sometimes needed into what do I need to add metrics or tracing or logs around. So getting it for free is really great. Like you get a bunch of stuff kind of all at once. But sometimes you lose that thoughtfulness of I'm going to add some spans within this particular code path because this is extremely critical to this functionality and really critical to this flow. And so being very thoughtful about it is like a really kind of important piece of developing software, in my opinion. And sometimes if you just have like something that's auto instrumented, you kind of lose that. So it's an approach like there's not a one size fits all approach. I think consistency and then really being thoughtful around where you're instrumenting the code are two like really important lessons that I've learned over the past few years, or more than a few years, I guess.
That's awesome. So sometimes magic bullets can be good, but also maybe a good starting point that you might need to go in and manually adjust a little
Yeah, I
bit.
think there's a maturity curve, right? And like when you're starting out, like sometimes like the easiest, like the lowest hanging fruit is really great, and then as you kind of increase on that maturity curve, sometimes like controlling your own destiny a little bit more becomes kind of the path to go.
Right on. The next one I've got here is, wouldn't the POS team also have an SLO that triggered an alert based on the latency SLI as delays in their service, although not directly customer interfacing, might have customer impact?
Yeah, 100%, right? I think the goal is that there's a consistency, right? I think a big part of kind of like the foundation of my talk was, SLOs are extremely important across the entire organization. If you are looking at kind of again like the maturity of an organization, the system, acquisitions, right? Um, it's not going to be, day one, everyone has the same kind of maturity in terms of SLOs. And so there's always going to be a gap. Even at steady state, there may be a gap still in SLOs across the organization. And so in this case, like the expectation would be like, yeah, the point of sale team would have an SLO based on SLIs that were latency for like a particular third party, right? And so they'd be able to have some sort of actionable plan when that SLO starts to deviate from the norm, right? Because there is obviously an impact based on my example. But I think it's like the belt and suspenders approach, right? There's a maturity level that needs to happen for all pieces of the system to be instrumented. But having the client as well as kind of the other side be instrumented based on like their own needs is a place where I think that a lot of organizations end up. And so, I think in this example, it's kind of like six in one hand, half a dozen in the other. There could have been both, right? And the point of sale team may have already been engaged. They could have a gap in their observability, right? They could have had a regression where their observability no longer works for some reason, or they may just not be there yet, right? They just haven't gotten to that place of instrumentation or SLO maturity. And so, as kind of one level up, now it's on us to basically start that process of troubleshooting when something goes wrong.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Being able to see all ends of the system helps you actually troubleshoot and figure out what's actually going on. I think the next one here is something along the lines of, in terms of the tracing, you kind of went into details as to how you use it as an educational tool, but like in practice, does that mean sitting down and sort of looking at the overview together, or maybe like you talked about mergers and grabbing acquisitions in and trying to have a shared maybe understanding of this? How does that actually play out day to day?
Yeah, I think that there's like a few pieces to it. I think in the most simplistic form, right? Like engineers on the team are basically able to say, okay, like I know that this is the entry point for a particular flow. And I can look at a trace and now see everything that happens within that, right? I really understand, okay, in this like external system, right? That maybe is just something, another team has built or what have you. I'm able to really understand, like I make this one single call, and now I can like have a learning exercise to really understand what's happening, under the hood, because it'll really kind of like help me understand, one, potentially how I can optimize what I'm doing on my side. Two, maybe I can just help that team in some sort of optimization or something that maybe they're missing. And three, if this is important enough for like an engineering team to expend the resources to say, okay, we're going to integrate with this system, it's important enough for me to really like learn how it works, one or two layers down from the surface level. And that's really where like tracing as the educational tool really comes, because it is the authoritative real-time source for what's actually happening in the system. And there's a lot of like edge cases, and this trace looks different than this trace for this same flow or the same entry point, right? And like that's kind of expected, but I think you can truly understand, rather than walking the code, what's actually happening in real time. And so like that is kind of the way to do it. I haven't like seen anything really formal other than kind of like the like lunch and learn or brown bags or what have you, which is like, hey, this is a tool that we can use. Let's look at this like system and then use traces to really understand what's happening and have someone like add a little bit of like context around it. I've really seen it be a lot of ad hoc as well, which is, I'm an engineer working on this integration. I really want to understand how it works. And so like the great thing about like engineering and software engineering specifically is like there's that place where folks just want to learn, right? Like folks don't like that, like that I don't know how this works, that black box, and using this as a tool to just learn more. Having that tool exist is just like it's the ticket for folks to be like, I'm going to use this because like I want to learn more, right? And so like even not having any formal program around it, I think is still like a really powerful educational tool if you frame it in that way, right?
Yeah, I totally hear you. I've certainly learned distributed tracing kind of in that like like brown bag kind of grab your lunch, sit in an auditorium and watch a screen or something like that, or sit in the cafeteria of the projector. It does really help to see like live examples of what's exactly happening, as opposed to I've also done the lunch and learn co-walks. I totally agree with you there.
I mean,
This is more of a
how many
question for me. Yep.
I was just gonna say,
Yeah, go
like,
ahead.
even last night I was using a new site and I just like opened up the Chrome DevTools to look at, right? The just for my browser, right? Because like I was interested to know how something worked. And I think that that's where, that's really where most engineers are, is like, cool, really want to see how this works. And tracing is just that, right? So, um, yeah.
Yeah, totally agree. So this is more of a question for me, just having been in this space before. I guess the question is like, how do you scale when there's uncertainty? Maybe it's around regulations, maybe it's around those acquisitions. Do you end up having like a plan A, plan B, plan C, or is it sort of like you have an overall long-term objective that you know to get to, and then sort of just plan along the way? It seems to be quite difficult when things are ever changing.
Yeah, that is like one of the like interesting pieces of like the market in which dutchie, my current company, operates in, is the regulatory uncertainty, right? And it's one of the few industries that, large markets, state by state, can just be essentially turned on, not overnight, but sometimes what feels like overnight. And so it adds a lot of just challenge, right? There's sometimes like large step increases, right? Which is relatively unique, and those can happen relatively fast, like a pretty steep step, I should say. I think part of it is, looking at things from one level outside of potentially like the engineering. perspective, like it's super important for folks in engineering to really understand like where the business could potentially be, right? Like what's the total addressable market for us and for this industry? What is realistic for us to capture? What do we believe, right, internally is our path to capture that, right, in terms of timing? What does the regulatory landscape look like based on, folks that are way smarter than me, right? Like looking at it and then using those as a number of inputs into, well, this is how we're going to design a system, right? And this is also how we should think about scaling the system so that we're not in a place where we're building and designing a system to scale to something that is totally unrealistic. And just as bad, we're not doing it in the opposite direction where we're building and designing a system that won't be able to scale to meet where the business believes that will be in, a quarter, 2 quarters, 2 years, whatever it is, right? So like again, I think it's like, a lot of my talk was like focusing on the customer, right? And I think in those like scaling conversations, it's really like having those deep conversations with like the business entities in the organization to really understand where we believe that we're going, and then really, within engineering, working to ensure that we can always fulfill those needs, but having like the data behind it, right, for the folks that need to, because engineering is not the only team that's the need to scale, right? Sales needs to scale and support, right, and operations and all of these different areas, and so engineering needs to be, a consumer of that and also an input to those discussions. And I have seen that organizationally, not at dutchie, but just in my career, not be the case, right? And I think it's such an important place to get plugged into, so that you can be really thoughtful about this.
I love that answer. Yeah. So like understand the goal and definitely tell your team about it. But you can tell even my myopic question is like, what does that mean for engineering? But I love what you said there. Right? Scaling actually implies more than just one department. That involves the entire org to be able to understand what that means in terms of sales, etc. That was great.
Yeah, yeah,
Jeff, listen, thank
100%.
you so much for your time today. Yeah, thank you so much for your time today. This is an awesome talk. I learned a ton from it. And the Q&A, of course, there's one for me there, but the Q&A, people are loving in the chat. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Cool. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm excited to read what Datadog came out with today. I have that up on my next browser. And yeah, really appreciate it. Thanks for everyone who attended.
Right on. Thanks, Jeff. Have a great one.
Bye.